Welcome everyone.
Hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name's Jane Hewitt and I'm the Capability Building Coordinator at Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. Just in case you don't know, Connecting Up and TechSoup are part of the Info Exchange Group, a not-for-profit social enterprise that tackles the biggest social challenges through the smart and creative use of technology. For those of you who haven't attended a webinar with us before, Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand facilitate an annual training calendar of online webinars, workshops, boot camps and webcons, and you can see the list that's upcoming for the year and up till February on both the websites. So welcome to the webinar today, the fundamentals of virtual facilitation with Saoirse and Erica from Nation Builder. And that's it from me, and I will just pass you over to them to get started on Zoom.
Absolutely, thank you so much, Jane. It is really great to have you all with us today, and I'm really excited that I can see your faces. For those of you who have come to the other sessions, I have been deeply yearning for that, so yay. But before we dive into all the content, as I know most of you obviously are Connecting Up members and you'll most commonly use the GoToWebinars functionality for these events. So just to kind of orient you with Zoom, on the bottom of the screen here, you're seeing that bar. So that's the ability for you to mute and unmute yourself, also to turn on and off your camera, and then that chat functionality. So feel free, drop your name in the chat, let us know where you're coming from, so that we can get a sense of everyone who's in the room. And we will, if you have questions, please drop them in as we go throughout, and we will have a dedicated questions session at the end. And if you've got any technical questions, do also feel free to pop them in there, and Erica and myself will triage that as we go through. So, who are we? I am Saoirse, and for those of you who've been with us for the past couple of weeks, you probably know who I am, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I am our Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships here at Nation Builder. I've been with the company for about 5 years now. I've worn many different hats. And prior to coming to Nation Builder, I worked in democratic politics here all around New England. As you can tell, I'm originally from across the pond in London, but I've been in the US now for nearly 10 years, which is kind of wild. And I've worked on political campaigns, nonprofits, predominantly in the digital infrastructure space. So setting up the digital infrastructure for folks to engage with their community at whole. And I just got a ping from someone asking if we are recording, and just to let you all know, we are recording and you will get it sent out afterwards. So with that, Erica, I'm going to pass it over to you to give us an introduction.
Hi everyone, nice to see you. My name is Erica Celis. I'm an account manager here in Australia. So I'm based in Hobart. And my background is in community organizing. I actually came to Australia to do a science degree a long time ago and ended up actually wanting to work in the advocacy space. So I worked for several environmental not-for-profits. That's where I learned to use Nation Builder and started kind of getting a feel for community organizing and organizing as a whole. I also spent some time volunteering on the Obama campaign back in 2008, where I learned a lot more about organized organizing. And I've been able to bring over all the things that I've learned from that campaign and others to share with my community here. So now in Australia, I work with dozens of Nation Builder users who need to organize and build their own communities.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so for the last couple of weeks, what we've dug into is the technology and the infrastructure that Nation Builder provides from a technological standpoint. Today's session, we're going to be focusing more on the educational component and the facilitative component. And to do that, I wanted to introduce you to our theory of change. And in particular, I wanted to highlight the leadership connection with Nation Builder software. And so Nation Builder was created 10 years ago to remove the barriers to entry of leadership. And leadership can and must come from everywhere. Times of crisis are illuminating. They shine a light on what is most fundamental, what is most important to us as people, our connection to each other, our need for one another, and how truly interdependent we are. And thrown into relief constantly during such chaos is the criticality of one thing: leadership. And Nation Builder's theory of change resolves to say, solving today's biggest challenge isn't about one leader. It's about millions. And Nation Builder exists to make it possible for anyone to easily mobilize their community and lead them to action. So with that, our experience and expertise. Why are we here? Why are we talking about facilitation? Why should you listen to us? So cumulatively, on our leadership team alone, we have 60 years of movement building, right? We are also lifelong practitioners at movement building in politics and advocacy and in the nonprofit space. We focus very heavily on the science of community organizing and facilitation and how that actually enables people to lead and lead better. So what are we actually going to cover today? Number one, we're going to look at leadership and organizing models. Number two, we're going to jump into what is facilitation and how do we facilitate. We're then going to move into how do we tell our story? What's the importance of telling our story? Then we're going to do some reflective and active listening session. And last but not least, we'll wrap out with where are you seeing facilitation right now and how can you actually use that in your day-to-day work life and personal life. And lastly, we will wrap out with questions as always. So before we dive into the tactics of how to facilitate, it is important to ground in the leadership and organizing strategies that we believe at Nation Builder actually allow for movements, nonprofits, and political parties to actually engage in the community building work they're trying to do. So up first, we have two very fundamental leadership and organizing models that some of you may be familiar with. The first is proxy organizing. That is where you're going to be dealing with a group of leaders and building out coalitions. This is very common in the political process. So if you're thinking about Congress and at the federal level, right, you're looking at leaders to organize and coalesce around a particular issue so that there is an ability to advocate on behalf of that. And therefore going into maybe creating legislative or policy change is very common with proxy organizing. Geographic organizing is focusing on localized communities who care about particular issues because it's physically close to them, right? In that example, you're thinking about local elections or local nonprofits. Up next, we have two others, ideological organizing and the snowflake organizing model. Ideological organizing is, I think, one that everyone is pretty familiar and common with, and this is where you're working towards something with like-minded people, most common in faith-based organizations and political parties. The snowflake organizing model is what was used in Obama's campaign in 2008, and we're going to talk more about the story component of that later on today. But what you're really getting in this snowflake organizing model is people who are able to activate local leaders and then connect with their own networks to recruit others. What you're getting from that type of organizing model is a distributed infrastructure, right? It allows other people to step up and become leaders in their own right. The last thing I want to talk about in this section is around the purpose relationship organizing. And that is what we believe at Nation Builder is kind of a combination of the four that we just talked through. And the principles of that are relationship building. So if y'all were with us last week and the week prior, we really dug into how do you own your own data? How do you manage to understand the relationships that you currently have with your supporters and your donors and whomever is in your community? The ownership piece is not just applicable when you're thinking about the actual data. We spoke a lot about owning your own data, but it's also about owning the actual relationships that you have with individuals, whether that be a voter if you're working on a campaign or a donor if you're in a nonprofit. Accessibility. This is accessibility to you as an organization or you as a person. The facilitative component is really key when you're thinking about how accessible is it to actually engage with our organization. Service. Are you of service to people? How do you serve them? How can they serve you? Is there a cycle at which people can go through to engage with you and to build a larger community? And last but not least is transparency. Transparency allows for a smooth process, and when facilitated correctly, can actually achieve outcomes that you would not get otherwise. Nation Builder helps leaders form relationships with like-minded people for a common purpose and facilitates recruitment of new leaders to help our customers' organizations grow. And so now we're going to jump right into what is facilitation. The definition of facilitate is to make easy or ease a process. And what a facilitator does is plan, guide, and manage a group event to ensure that the group's objectives are met effectively with clear thinking, good participation, and full buy-in from everyone who is involved. So the act of facilitation. A facilitator is a person who helps a group of people to work better together, understand their common objectives, and plan how to achieve these objectives during meetings or discussions. And in doing so, the facilitator actually is able to remain neutral, meaning he or she does not take a particular position in the discussion that's being had. So let's say you've actually been asked to facilitate a meeting. What does that actually mean? Do you just ensure that everyone's been introduced? Maybe kick off with a quick icebreaker exercise? Or is your main role simply to stand up and flip the flip chart or the virtual flip chart, now that we are on virtual days? But what preparation do you need to do? And how do you manage the event to actually pull the whole thing together? In many types of group situation, and in particularly complex discussions, or those where people have different views and interests, good facilitation can make the difference between success and failure. To facilitate effectively, you must be objective. This doesn't mean you have to come from outside the organization or team. It simply means that for the purpose of this group process, you will take a neutral stance. You step back from the detailed content, and in particular from your own personal views, and focus purely on the group process. The group process is the approach used to manage discussions. Get the best from all of the people in the meeting and bring that event through to a successful conclusion. The secret of great facilitation is a group process that flows, and with it will flow the group's ideas, solutions, and decisions too. The last thing to note here is that facilitation can actually take a lot of mental effort, meaning that it can be difficult to think about and contribute content while facilitating. Neutrality is important. So if you have an interest in the outcome, or have skills or experience and information or authority, which is important for a successful outcome, then you should actually consider bringing in an external facilitator, either within your organization or external from it. So now let's think about facilitating an event. Up first, we want to create or share agreements at the top so that people know how to participate. Are you as a facilitator open to live participation and chat from people? Can people share their own visuals? You want to orient people to the technology, right? So what we just did at the top there, where's the mute button? How do I go on and off video? And if people are speaking who aren't the presenters, make sure that you are asking them to state their name prior to them speaking. The other thing to think about here are different types of facilitation roles. So you will have a lead facilitator, maybe you'll have co-facilitators, a chat facilitator in a virtual space. You want to design and plan the group process and select the tools that best help the group progress toward that outcome. Icebreakers and introductions can actually be a part of that toolkit, but also think about the technology. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the actual event process. Read the room. Are people engaged, right? I'm scrolling through right here to see who's looking at another device. Are you engaged? Is my tone too much? Am I too low, too high? If you're facilitating, you need to be able to meet people where they're at, right? Understanding that in a virtual experience, that can be a little bit more difficult because I'm speaking into a void, right? I'm not hearing the normal sounds of someone coughing or moving in their chair uncomfortably. So when you're reading the room virtually, you want to be able to interact with people and see folks' faces, which is why I'm really excited that I can see you all today. Guide and control the group process to ensure that there is effective participation. Participants achieve a mutual understanding. Their contributions are considered or included in the ideas and solutions of the decision that emerges, and participants take shared responsibility for the outcome. And last but not least is ensure that outcomes, actions, and questions are properly recorded and allow for a debrief and a question component to make sure that that outcome is actually set with everyone. So, I want to talk about how we do this with a community. And so what you're seeing on the slide here are 3 types of events where you can facilitate in a particular way. So we've got check-ins, story circles, and community circles. And all of these events allow for people to connect as human beings, grounding in this concept of personal sharing. So I'm going to ask Erica, if you would be so inclined, to do a little role play with me of what a check-in is for everyone today.
Sure. Just some context first. A check-in is something that we use on a daily basis when we go into meetings one-on-one or in small groups. And it helps us connect first as humans to then talk about the content. So here we go. This is my check-in. I'm going to pretend like Sorsha and I just met up for a meeting. Hey, Sorsha, good to see you. Want to check in? I'm happy to go first. Okay. Well, I am sorry I'm late, because I am late to this meeting. I went to drop my daughter off at daycare and she wouldn't let go of me and she was crying. So I had to sit there for a little while she got comfortable. But I made it, I'm here. But also I'm a little bit distracted because I have like emergency in my inbox that is just glaring at me. So that's me today.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm okay. I started my day with yoga, so I'm feeling good. I'm like actually present and ready to hit the ground running. End scene. A check-in allows for you to get present in the particular space that you are setting. So in team meetings or in stand-ups or in donor readouts, those types of meetings that happen regularly, if you give the space for people to connect as human beings at the top, what we have seen, and that you have someone to facilitate that space, well, we've seen that people are actually able to be more present in the moment. A guided facilitation of that, for example, if Erica had checked in the way she just did, and I had responded with, oh my goodness, and my daughter did exactly the same thing today. As a facilitator, you might be able to guide that conversation and say, it sounds like y'all should connect offline. You've got something to chew on there, the two of you to talk about, but we've actually only got 30 minutes, and so we want to continue with the progress. It opens up that space for personal sharing, but allows people to come back into the workspace once they are ready. So story circles. Story circles we're not going to give you an example of, because it is about a 2.5-hour experience where you're in a group with 8 to 10 people and you're given a prompt to share what your story is. The purpose of story circles is to expedite the process of community building. And so it allows for you to actually get to know people based on a prompt and a shared prompt that people can reflect into of what their story is. The last one on here is community circles. And community circles are grounded in a thematic. What I mean by a thematic is there is a particular issue that's impacting your community. If we think back to those organizing and leadership models, that geographic organizing model, there's something happening in your locality. A community circle allows for the community to come together and empty, right? So unload whatever the feelings and the issues and the emotion is around a particular issue, so that you can then come out of that space being empty to go into a solution mode.
Yeah, so Sorsha, I just want to clarify that I understood that, right? Because I haven't been part of many community circles, but I feel like they'd be super powerful here in Australia. So when you're in a community circle and around a topic that all the people in there care about, you're not actually there to solve the problem yet. Exactly.
It's a very unique space in that you are there to listen. You are not there to respond. And so it's a safe that is created, and it has to be facilitated by people who, if we remember back to the guidelines of facilitation there, right, you're neutral. And that then allows for themes to be identified that have come out from everyone's sharing, so that you can come out of the confined space to then go into solutions mode. Awesome. Okay. So facilitation and leadership are inextricably linked, if you haven't already guessed. We know that there are challenges facing leaders across the world today. Number one, build community. Leadership is lonely, and isolation is the top challenge named by leaders. Leadership experiences can be hard, but you must know that you're not alone. Leaders need support to be in community with each other. And I'm very aware that there are probably thousands of leaders in Connecting Up that y'all all have the ability to engage with. Lean on each other as executive directors and managers, managing directors of nonprofits and leaders of teams on this call. I implore you to reach out to other leaders. It can be extremely lonely, but if you are able to come together and facilitate each other, you will have a more successful engagement as leaders yourself. Secondly, we need to equip leaders. New skills are required for leaders in this era. Y'all can learn from each other. Leaders are able to learn very well from each other. We need to equip more leaders so that we can see a diversity in leadership. And lastly is solving for overcoming what holds us back, right? So building that community. So to wrap out this section, I wanted to just cap off with, what do we currently know about successful leaders? We know that they put people at the center of what they're doing. We know that they can be facilitative, right? They're able to navigate and move through situations to come to a solution. We know that they are very good listeners, and we have a whole section on listening coming up. We know that they're able to distribute leaders, right? They are able to identify people within their community that can step up and lead. They're able to build and retain teams, build a community, be observant and adaptable to what's going on in the moment. And last but not least, to tell their story, which brings us very nicely into our next section, grounding in story. So storytelling is not new, and nor is it revolutionary, but it is a vital skill for facilitation. There are many different ways to tell your story, but today's session, we're going to be focusing on one theory in particular. So I would love if everyone could just pop in the chat, are you familiar with the story of self, us, and now? Just give me a yes or a no, maybe. No, okay, I'm seeing lots of no, I'm not. Oh, I got a yes. No, maybe. No, okay. All right, so I'm getting a consensus of no and a little. All right, well, great. This excites me because that means we are learning something new together. So I cannot take any credit for this whatsoever. I am just someone who has practiced it for the last 8 years. This practice of public narrative was developed by Marshall Ganz, a former longtime United Farm Workers organizer and a current Harvard professor. And it was used as a template by the Obama campaign in 2008. Public narrative brings 3 stories together into one. Each person has their own public narrative. Your story of self is unique, and your stories of us and now are similar to others in your community, though you may actually express them differently or in your own way. So a story of self. A story of self is a personal story that Ganz says shows why you are called to what you have been called to. Everyone has a story about an experience that got them involved in a given cause. If the cause is improving local schools, maybe one person got involved because their kids are getting a poor education and have outdated textbooks. Someone else is a local store owner who sees children every day when they come to buy snacks. The story of self communicates that teller's values, whether it's the opportunity for children or it takes a village. The story of self presents a specific challenge to the teller that's actually faced with that challenge, and the choice that they made about how to deal with the challenge itself. Ganz says that this story invites listeners to connect with the teller. The story of us. The story of us is a collective story that Ganz says illustrates the shared purposes, goals, and vision of a community or an organization. And as with the story of self, this story focuses on a challenge, a choice, and an outcome. The story of us, of a school reform group, for example, might be, together, we are a community of local parents and residents who got into this work because we're fighting for our own kids' educations in a failing school system. Each of us wanted the best for our sons and daughters and our neighbors. Then we found each other and realized that the fight was bigger than just my kid. We realized that we needed each other to win this fight, and so we started this movement. The story of us invites other people to actually be a part of your story of self. Lastly, a story of now. And a story of now is about the challenge that this community faces, the choices it must make, and the hope to which they can aspire. A story of now is urgent. It's rooted in the values you celebrated in your story of self and us, and a contradiction to those values that requires action. There's always some discrete and urgent challenge you can present to listeners. And in the case of that school reform group, the story of now might involve getting rid of a superintendent or pressing for more public funding for education. The story of now actually invites people to join in taking hopeful action on that pressing challenge. So what I would ask you to do today is reflect on how can you ground in a story of self? How does that then connect to your community or your organization? And what is the challenge that you are facing that you want to project to people in the story of now? You need to develop several versions of your story. Practice telling story to your staff, your co-workers, your friends, your family. Get feedback. As with anything, the more you practice, the better you're going to be. And be okay with the fact that your public narrative is going to change over time, right? You're going to learn how to express your story of self more clearly as you tell it repeatedly. And the shifting makeup of your community actually might change that story of us. Or maybe the group will take on a new and different challenge that requires the story of now to change. Your public narrative is never going to be final. Be okay with that, because that will actually enable you to ground yourself in your story and thus facilitate when other people need to be moved to action. I'm going to pause there for a second. How's everyone doing? We're at like that halfway mark. I like to just get a little check-in before we move into some listening. I'm getting an all good. Okay, all right.
I'm wondering, Sorsha, I'm wondering how many of the folks here have already had to do some virtual facilitation in the last, 5-6 months?
Oh, I love that.
How many of you have already had to do some facilitation? Well, Karen weekly with webinars.
Oh, I'm getting a thumbs up. Okay.
Yeah, frequently. Okay.
Frequently.
That's good.
Awesome.
Every day, team meetings.
Online weekly video, yes. Our world has changed. We have to, and so I'm really excited that we're in this conversation today. Yay. Deliver classes every week. Oh yes, education facilitation is all the respect for you. Okay, well now we're going to jump into listening. So in this section, we are going to identify what listening is and isn't. We're going to develop some active listening skills. And we're going to identify why it is important to the role of a facilitator. Before we do that, I want to hear from you all again. And I want to ask you, when was the last time that anyone in this room, please feel free to unmute here, experienced someone truly listening to them, that you felt truly heard? Anyone? Last evening. Okay, all the time. All right. Sunday.
How long the meeting is.
Did someone unmute? If you did.
Depends how long the meeting is. Some of ours are an hour and a half, 2 hours, so you lose them by the end.
Okay, often, yesterday and today, lots of great people around me. Oh, I love that. Most times. Okay. All right. Wow, this is an amazing group.
This is interesting because we may be challenging you today with what it means to actually feel heard. Because after learning what you're about to learn, you might go, do I actually feel heard, or could it feel different?
Yes, and my personal experience with that was when I first learned and did this Lead by Listening training that we run at Nation Builder, which we're doing a very, very small version of this. This is normally a 4-hour session of Lead by Listening. But when I first did it, I remember coming home to my partner and using some of these tactics and being like, oh my God, you never actually listened to me. So we'll see how that goes. All right, with all of that said, we're going to jump into, I like to start this with what is listening, what is not listening, okay? So being distracted. Devices, right? I have 2 phones right here that will distract me if I am not actually listening to what someone is saying. What's happening out the window, right? There may be something fantastic out there, but if you're not present and listening, then what's happening out the window shouldn't matter. Good tripping. So this one I know I'm guilty of. I've done it all the time. So an example of that is I've had a really crappy day at work and Erica responds to me and says, oh, I'm sure it wasn't that bad. That's good tripping. She's telling me that what I feel isn't valid. Denying someone's reality, right? So I say to Erica, oh, I can see there's a spider on my wall. She's like, well, I can't see a spider on your wall, so I don't think that's not real, right? Like you're denying someone's reality around them. Judging or analyzing, another one that I am hands up guilty of. That an example of that is, well, this wouldn't be the case if only you, and finish that sentence. I'm sure we've all heard that. Problem solving. This one is a big one, right? I share with you something that's happening for me in my life at this moment, and you've got a list of 10 things that I can do to fix that problem. That's actually not listening. That's problem solving. Waiting to speak and interrupting. So this one's actually pretty important because there are moments in a conversation where if you wait to speak, you miss the beat and the person takes it onto a different trajectory. And if you interrupt, it can actually be extremely damaging to the conversation and take a person like back out of their shell of where they were going to share from. Making it about you. This is human nature. People want to say, oh, I felt that too. I've experienced that as well. That's just human nature. But again, it's not actually listening. And last but not least is the got it phenomenon, right? So I say, okay, we are going to need to go to the grocery store and we're going to need to go to the gym and and someone's like, yep, got that, that makes sense. Yes, yep, totally, got that. Again, you're not listening in that situation. You are just projecting onto that individual that you've got it, everything's covered. So with that being said, let's think about some other ways that we can listen that are non-verbal. So leading by listening, right? You can actually improve the quality of the speaker and the experience of the audience by making sure your non-verbals and your communications with that are visible to people. So for example, posture, right? So they're sitting up or leaning in. This is really important when you're thinking about virtually, especially if there are cameras on, so that you can actually see that people are engaging with your content. Facing the speaker, right? So I know that there are multiple screens in people's lives at the moment. So if your camera's over here and you're actually looking there, but your reflection's up here, it's not helpful for the conversation. Eye contact. You can do it. You can make eye contact through the screen. I promise you. It might feel weird, but it's actually really good for listening. And put the devices away. We just don't need them. If we're in a conversation and we're listening, put them away. So now we're going to go into 2 types of active listening, and Erica and I are going to kind of go through a role play to see what that looks like. So up first is reflective listening. This allows us to slow down the conversational and be intentional. It shows humility as well, right? We're not always going to get it right. I myself went through that list of not listening, and I know I've done it probably 10 times today, right? When you're rushed, you're busy, there's things going on. So the prompt for this, right, when someone gives you a statement or a sentence, the prompt to think about in terms of how do you do reflective listening is it sounds like or it seems like. So with that said, Erica, I'm going to bring you onto the virtual stage and we'll do a little listening activity.
Okay. So in this scene, Sorsha and I are friends, and I am talking about a not-for-profit situation that I have. I work for I am a volunteer board member of a not-for-profit. So, hey, Sorsha. Yeah, this is what's going on with me. I'm on the board of this not-for-profit, and I've been tasked with raising $5,000 for my personal network of friends and family for our end of the year campaign. And I've reached 1,500, but then I haven't had a new donation for several days. And I'm just not sure how many more times I can ask my friends or family for money.
Oof. Sounds like you're taking on a lot for this nonprofit. And you are being asked to engage with your friends and family to raise money.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And seeing. So that may feel weird, right? I quite literally regurgitated back to her what she said. But again, what that allows for is a stop in the conversation, right? It shows you to be, it gives you the ability to be intentional, especially in spaces where there may be conflict and people may not be able to hear each other. Your reflective listening skill set of being able to regurgitate back to someone what they said allows for clarity and check for understanding. If we had all the time in the world and we were to continue that conversation, I would go into some other tactics of open-ended questions of, tell me more about that. It sounds like X. Does that mean Y, right? Trying to avoid the pitfalls of projecting my own opinion onto her and listening to her. Erica, how did that feel for you?
It felt like we had a pause. I was almost expecting to hear about a time that you had something similar. And then when it didn't come, it actually let me think a little bit more deeply about how I was feeling. So yeah, it kind of dissipated how I was feeling, strangely.
Okay, so up next is another type of active listening. So this is validative listening. This is a synthesis of what you've just heard, and then you validate their experience. So the prompt in this scenario is, it can be really blank when blank. And just to say, these prompts are ways for you to get this muscle and to build this muscle. Once you are doing validative and reflective listening in your day-to-day lives, you'll have your own versions of these prompts, but just use them as you're starting to practice this skill. So I'm going to jump in here, Erica, and you can be my listening partner. Okay, so, hey, I need to talk to you about something. And you know the nonprofit that I'm at now, that I'm working at. So we rely on a major grant every year from the city for a pretty large portion of our annual budget. And we just got the news that we were rejected last week, and this is the first time ever. And everyone is just in disarray, like in full-on panic mode, because we've actually already spent a portion of the budget.
Oh, wow. Sorsha, it can be so hard to navigate a situation like that, especially when the budget has already been spent.
And see. So that's the validation component of that. She has listened. How I received that was that she empathized, saying, oh, okay, that's rough. And then was able to validate what was happening, and then reflected also the particular experience of when being that we've already spent a portion of that budget. So now I'm going to move in. Oh, sorry, go for it, Erica.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the desire is real to like want to ask Sorsha, could you guys maybe do this, or like, you know, like to try and troubleshoot it for her. It's really there. But I know learning this skill and using it has helped diffuse so many tricky conversations with customers that even if though it's uncomfortable, it's worth pursuing.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to jump into the last piece here on listening, and I have a challenge for you all. How long do you think you can keep a person talking without having to ask a question? You honestly don't have to offer anything other than being there. So think about using things like open-ended questions. What, why, how? Close-ended questions of the yes, no type tend to stump a conversation. So think about those open-ended ones. Combine reflections or validations with an open-ended follow-up question to continue that dialogue and continue that conversation. So then language like, tell me more, or what is it that's happening for you right now? Or why did that make you feel that way? It allows for the conversation to be opened, as you are continuing to listen to someone without giving a personal, oh, this happened to me, so now let's listen to my story, or the good tripping, right? Like, no, you're good. It didn't actually happen like that, right? So I will put that in the follow-up email for y'all, so you have some kind of structure to think about your listening as we move forward. Okay, so now I'm going to take us into our last section of today's section, which is virtual spaces. Excuse me. And as we saw in the group chat, a lot of you are already facilitating spaces, which is amazing. And I really hope today's content gives you some ideas of different ways that you can actually facilitate moving forward. So in the virtual world that we now live in, there are a lot of things that have completely shifted. And for those of you that were here at our very first Connecting Up event, which feels like 500 years ago now, but I believe it was only 5 months ago, we did a full session on how to host a virtual event and all of the kind of nuts and bolts of that. So I'll make sure that we link out to that in the follow-up email as well. But what I want to do is just kind of give you a brief overview of those virtual spaces. So facilitating your community with virtual events, right? These are 4 of the most common virtual event types. So we've got your educational. That's where you can kind of share knowledge and disseminate information to individuals. We're in an educational virtual event right now, right? You've got your webinars, you've got your panels. Those are spaces where there tends to be 1 to 4 people who are speaking. And I know that I've been to many of them where I can't see folks' faces, or I can't engage with them, or there's no chat functionality. And it's very isolating, is how I feel and I experience those content. And I tend to not actually engage or retain that information as much as if I could have been like, oh my goodness, I scrolled through and I saw someone who used to work at a nonprofit that I used to work at, right? Creating the human connection with people allows for people to retain information better. Fundraisers. Ooh, raising money online has been tough this year. That is for sure. But it still needs to happen, right? There are still nonprofits out there who are doing some amazing work that need money. And there are a number of different tactics and strategies to think about with your fundraising efforts. Some kind of top tips that I will recommend to y'all. Not all of your content can transfer, so be key in what you do want to take virtual versus what you had planned for an in-person event. That's number 1. Number 2, again, make it community, make it exciting, allow people to be involved, allow them to have ownership of what they're doing on your behalf, and use technology to aid in that. So things like creating a pledge concept, creating a time-bound campaign using money bomb pages where you can actually set up, I've got 3 days to raise $3,000 and it's exciting, you're getting sharing. Again, there's a lot more information on the fundraising stuff that we can share with you all. Conferences. I've been to quite a few conferences that have gone virtual, and I've got to say they're not that bad. It is an interesting concept to have. Maybe I was at one recently that had over 1,500 people in attendance. The thing I would recommend if you are hosting large events, like we're looking at anything with over 300 to 500 plus, that's where you really want to employ a technology that is built to interact. So yes, you can do Zoom as a component of it, but there are a number of conference software setups out there. Hopin is a really great one. The key ingredients, in my opinion, for that, you want to have a networking space where attendees can connect with each other. You also want to have ease of accessibility to the presenters. One of the most exciting things about this virtual space is the ability to be in a virtual room with some of these brilliant minds. And so allow for ease of accessibility with those brilliant minds and those speakers that you have. I've seen a lot of folks do kind of intimate fireside chats that you can sign up with prior to the event. If you are a nonprofit organizing that, that's a donation that gets you a ticket to that. There's a lot of creative ways, but giving that accessibility to folks is key in making it successful. And last but not least is the community component. And we've talked about this in the different configurations of community gatherings. If there's one thing you take away from today, start doing check-ins at your organization. I promise you it will change the way that people show up and their ability to be better at their job. So some other tips and tricks of the trade to leave you all with. Get the tech sorted. If you're going to be hosting any of these virtual events, Think about your video conferencing software. Think about your internet connection. Are you able to hardwire in? Is it Wi-Fi? Are people going to have to use hotspots, right? Make sure all of that is planned so you can have a successful and streamlined event. Power. I know this sounds simple, but I can count on my hands, unfortunately, the amount of times I've been in meetings where someone's laptop has died or my own laptop is about to die. Have your power near you or be plugged in a stationary place when you're doing an event. And last but not least is audio. There is nothing worse than if you can't make a live event, having to listen back to poor audio quality on a webinar recording or an event. So try. There's a bunch of cheap mics out there online. I am using this tiny little one. Erica has a much bigger one. Yeah, there we go, she will display. But it allows, they're cheap, right? And you can get them on all the different delivery sites. So grab a mic, it's inexpensive. If you're using a computer every single day to connect with people, it's a great investment. Okay, last but not least, create a good experience. Everyone should be on camera if possible. We get to see each other. We know that right now people are yearning for community, so let's give it to them. Mute. When you are going through a live presentation, it is best to have people on mute who aren't presenting so that you do not have any unnecessary background noise. Record it. Not everyone can make the assigned time. Make sure your content is available. It also gives you strategy to actually take sound bites out of events that you've done and post that on social media and engage with it in a different and meaningful way. That also opens up the audience at which of people who can actually be in your virtual experiences. And last but not least is that content piece. So again, not all of the content you would plan for your event can be ported into a virtual experience. So make sure that you review and trim the fat when necessary. Fun fact, the average adult has about a 20-minute attention span. So you'll notice earlier when I paused at that halfway mark, that's because I know that a lot of y'all were like tuning out. And that's okay, because we all do it. The other thing here is use virtual tools when available. And what I mean by that is if I was drawing out today something to show you, and I did it over here on my whiteboard, that's not helpful. Use the tools that are available online if you are doing something that requires creativity in a live event. With all of that said, that leaves us about 12 minutes for questions. So I am gonna
There's one really good one. There's one really good one. This is from Karen. Just wondering about the check-in. If you don't engage with what the person has shared, is that sharing then still positive?
Oh, that is a great question. I think it depends on what was shared. And so if the sharing was like, I'll say that my sharing was quite flippant in that like, yeah, I had yoga this morning, I felt good, right? Whereas Erica's sharing was actually quite, like I felt empathy for Erica in that sharing of like, oh my goodness, her daughter was crying this morning. And so it just depends on what the sharing is and what the relationship level is with each individual who is sharing would be my response to that. But Erica, would love your thoughts.
Yeah, I think if there's something quite heavy, personal, if you're the next person to check in, it can be really weird to just like, not say anything. So even just thanking that person for sharing that level of information is enough of an acknowledgement without having to go into like trying to troubleshoot their issues. And also then using the chat can be a really soft way of acknowledging what they said without having to take up the airtime in the space to do it.
Yeah, I think just that pause, if it is a heavy piece of like, thank you for sharing. My day is A, B, and C.
Yeah. And as the facilitator, I think you'll have to lead by example if this is something new. So when you do your check-in, do it first and give the level of information that you would like others to give, leading by example.
Oh, yeah.
Just want to say thanks. That was helpful. But yeah, just because in your example, like for examples to Erica, you'd said basically you weren't really engaged with the meeting. So I was like, as the facilitator, how would you kind of deal with that kind of sharing? Like, it's good for everyone to know where you're at, but if someone shares like, I'm not even really in a space to be participating in this meeting right now, what would you guys suggest is like a good way to deal with that check-in? Or how do you like prep your team? Like, do you need to prep your team? Like, we're going to be doing this check-in thing and this is how it works. Because also, yeah, it's kind of maybe a bit awkward if someone like shares that and then you just keep going with the meeting.
Yeah. So what I do is if someone were to share something like that, and it has happened in the recent past before, I'll say something like, all right, well, we've all had a long week and some of us could really use some more time. So this meeting doesn't need to take up the full half an hour, or I'm going to shift things around so that we work on the things, talk about the things that we all need to be here for at the beginning. And then maybe Erica and someone else that needs to go see their inbox can go and do that. So yeah, someone like Erica that had that kind of a morning might need to leave sooner. And I agree. Yes, prep your team and say check-ins is a thing we'd like to adopt. This is how it works.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll just add to that is if you are going to implement this, I highly recommend that you create expectations for each other. Because what you're asking of individuals is to come and be vulnerable. And if there isn't a trust level for vulnerability, you can actually cause fractures. And so making sure that if the other nuance I think there, Karen, is that if it's a manager sharing versus a direct report, and what that can mean if you're in a hierarchical organization. And so creating expectations of each other or some type of shared values, we'll call it, as a team, will really help to build the trust so that folks can check in a meaningful way. And the piece of like, I'm not ready to be present in this meeting, like what Erica said, 100%. And I think there's also just allowing for that. Like you can hear that. And if they then decide to no longer participate in that meeting, I think, again, if you're in a hierarchical structure, figuring out if there's a further problem.
I think I statements is something that we didn't explain, Sorsha, but also this will help maybe that person who's like the conversation hogger, Karen. If you're worried about people checking in and that taking up too much time, one of the expectations should be that the check-in should be using I statements. So you say, I this morning, I this and this, not like, and every time we, and they always, and those sorts of things that tend to take up a lot of time. So the I statements.
In this particular instance, he has a long way and slow way and roundabout way of getting to a point. So we hear it 4 different times in the conversation. So we have to interrupt, unfortunately, to say, look, thank you, and I don't mean to interrupt, but we are running out of time. So we just sort of, can we move on and perhaps come back to it at the end if we have some more time. That's the only way we can deal with it.
Okay, so I think we've got a question from Susie that says, oh no, sorry, let me grab Pamela. So do you have tips for a quick 15-minute stand-up? How do you check in with everyone but also stick to time? Any tips for a few to share check-in but not everyone will stand up will take more than 15? So our technical side of the house does a stand-up in Slack. So they will have their 15-minute human check-in, and then they'll do a Slack check-in of blockers for the day, projects that are being worked on. So I think it really is just about what type of check-in fits for your team, but building in that functionality of human connection is really important for trust. And Erica, I don't know if you have any other tips on that one.
Yeah, the use of I statements will reduce the amount of time, but also it might go over sometimes, and it just takes practice. You have to be able to then maybe the next meeting go, hey, last time it was great check-in, but we went over and ran out of time. Could everyone please just explicitly try and speak for just 1 or 2 sentences?
Okay, so Susie's question says, how can you make it visually engaging that doesn't cost a fortune in designing a space? Is there a program that helps to design virtual environments?
I'm not sure
I'm not-
if Susie's talking about like the background or what it is. Maybe we can clarify that, Susie.
That would be great.
Background.
Statements.
Yeah.
Background. Okay, so yes, so virtual backgrounds. There's definitely, so Unsplash gives you the ability to grab imagery that you can put in for free. And yeah, Zoom has virtual background where you can add your own graphics on top of a virtual background. And then if you have a wall in your house that is just a white wall, you can use that as like a green space behind you where you can put your logo onto. So I hope that helped. Yeah, Photoshop as well is great. Okay.
So there's two other questions there. How would you recommend getting more quiet voices heard during a session?
Prompting people.
And that could even be, yeah, that could even be, I don't, if you are using Zoom or something like it, you'll notice that in the chat you can message to everyone or just one person individually. For those people that are maybe a little less confident in speaking, I would message them directly and say, is there anything that you want to add to this? So that not everybody, they're not put on the spot, but they are called out. And then just saying, we want to hear from others in the room who haven't spoken yet today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you are doing it in a check-in model, the expectation is that everyone in the room checks in. And so even if your check-in is, oh, I'm not doing too great, I don't want to take up airtime, everyone still has that moment, and we call it airtime, so that you're given at least one moment to talk in the session.
There is a funny observation from David, just an observation, 48 people were on the webinar, which is essentially a communication skills and a little technical help, but only 12 to 15% were guys.
There we go. Thank you, David.
Which is more a comment that unfortunately too many guys don't give good communication skills a high enough priority when it comes to meetings. They just want to churn through, do the job, and not necessarily think of doing the check-ins and the offline follow-ups and stuff.
Yeah, problem solvers.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, David. I have had check-ins where you simply rate how you are feeling out of 10, and you can then choose to follow up with an I statement. That is a really interesting tactic. Not something that we've tried here at Nation Builder, but that sounds amazing. That sounds like a really great thing. Did I see another question? How would you, I've used the tech, easy to give everyone a set time on a timer with phone, then you're not winding. Okay, yeah. Okay, I see a couple of folks are jumping. So just to kind of wrap us out, we've had 3 amazing sessions together. If you didn't get the chance to attend those, I will make sure that you get a copy of them in our roundup email. You will get a normal follow-up email today that will give you, again, access to that sandbox solution and the extended free trial. And the amazing Erica does Nation Builder Live for the Australia and New Zealand region. So I will kick it over to her to tell you about that.
Yeah, so it's just a 1 hour on Wednesdays at 10 every fortnight where people who are thinking about using Nation Builder can come along and see a demo and have a chat. So we'll also send a link to the next one coming up.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for welcoming Erica and I into the Connecting Up family. And yes, there will definitely be a recording. And we look forward to being in some more sessions with you later in the year.
Cool. Thank you both very much, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Like Saoirse said, I'll be sending out the recording to this and those links that they mentioned later on today. And can I just ask people really quickly, would you just type in if you prefer Zoom or GoToWebinar, just so we can maybe switch things up in the future. But yeah, thank you very much. Do check out both Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand websites for upcoming webinars and workshops. Thanks a lot. Bye everybody.